Okay, we're gonna continue going over the agreement of sale with pages 3 and 4. We're gonna cheat over to 5 a little bit to make sure we cover all of the financing and mortgage contingencies here. But page 3, right at the top, zoning. Failure of this agreement to contain the zoning classification except in cases where the property and each parcel thereof, if subdividable, is zoned solely or primarily to permit single-family dwelling, will render this agreement voidable at buyer's option. And if voided, the buyer gets the deposit money back. So if you're selling a property and they're currently using it as residential, it looks just like any other residential property. You go in, there's a kitchen, there's a living room, there's beds, you know, and everybody's using it as a house. But it's actually zone C1 for commercial or commercial business or mixed use village, whatever the local municipality denotes it as. And you just put in there that it's, you either leave it blank or you put in there residential because it looks residential. And then later on, the buyer finds out through their lender that, hey, you know, we can't get this thing financed because of the zoning, or just they just figure out that it's now commercial and not residential. Somehow the buyer can just say, well, I don't want to buy this property, you know, I'm going to back out. That makes you look bad then, because now you have to explain to your seller why the buyer gets a deposit money back after 4 weeks of it going under contract. So just make sure that you have the correct zoning, especially if the property is on a main street through, let's say, Main Street, Mechanicsburg, or Trindle Road, Mechanicsburg, or something like that. Make sure you check, okay? No, this is, that would be a different contract. Connor asked if the reverse could be true, if it was commercial, if your intention is to buy commercial and it's actually residential, that would be a whole different contract. So, yeah. Okay. Yes, the zoning, Alyssa just asked, where can we find the zoning? It's in Bright MLS. But if need be, you can also look in the individual township municipality and they'll have the zoning map, okay? Most of them are very easy to read and color coded, okay? Fixtures and personal property. A, it is possible for certain items of personal property to be so integrated into the property that they become fixtures and will be regarded as part of the property and therefore included in the sale. Buyer and seller are encouraged to be specific when negotiating what items are to remain, okay, or excluded. So part B gives us a list of items that are included, okay? Get to know these items. They are, just go through it real quick. Plumbing, heating, gas fireplace logs, radiator covers, security systems that are hardwired, thermostats, lighting fixtures, pools, spas, and hot tubs, including covers and cleaning equipment, electric fencing systems, excluding the collar, okay? Garage door openers, transmitters, mounting brackets, and hardware for TV. Not the TV, but the hardware for it that is attached to the wall. Sound equipment, unpotted shrubbery. So if you have a plant that's in a pot, they can take it with them. If it's planted into the ground, it stays, okay? The biggest thing that I highlighted here, and we always seem to have an issue, especially in rural areas where a lot of people like to use pellet stoves or wood stoves or coal stoves. Any remaining heat and cooking fuel stored on the property at the time of settlement. So if the oil has a full tank in it, that stays with the property, okay? Unless the tank is leased, which is a whole different subsection then. But if you have a seller and they're in the middle of a contract and you know they have oil heat, I would advise them to just say, do not fill this up, okay? Just get enough to get you through and leave the next people at least a quarter of a tank, something to have them get started. Don't leave them with an empty tank. But don't fill it up because you're going to regret it. Okay. So just make a note of that, especially now in the winter time here, when people are starting to fill those things up. Okay. The other thing to be very specific about is secondary heat sources. Like I said, pellet stoves, wood stoves. If you notice that type of equipment, find out first off if it stays, and if it does, write it into the contract. Because again, if it's not in the contract, it's not part of the sale, and people do change their minds. Okay. Part C, the following items are not owned by the seller and may be subject to a lease. So we see things such as solar panels, water treatment systems, propane tanks. If it's a leased item, it should be in the disclosure first off, but if you see propane or oil tanks or anything like that, just ask. Okay. And then lastly, excluded items and fixtures. Again, be very specific. Refrigerator. Which refrigerator? Kitchen refrigerator, garage refrigerator, give a place of it. So you want to be very specific when you do that, because most people do have 2 refrigerators. And if you just put down a refrigerator and they leave the garage one and keep the kitchen one, who's right, who's wrong? Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Next, buyer financing. Okay. Remember the old contract? Right at the top, this section, it would immediately start off with accept or waived. Okay. You either have a mortgage contingency or you don't. Well, now that portion is later on in this section, but the first thing they talk about is buyer financing, part A here. Buyer may elect to make this agreement contingent upon obtaining mortgage financing. Regardless of any contingency elected in this agreement, if buyer chooses to obtain mortgage financing, the following applies. Okay, so this applies if they get a mortgage, irregardless if they waived or make the mortgage contingency a part of the elected contingencies. 1, buyer will be in default of this agreement if buyer furnishes false information. Okay, to anyone concerning buyer's financial and or employment status, fails to cooperate in good faith with processing the mortgage loan application, including payment for and ordering of appraisal without delay, fails to lock in interest rates as stated below, or otherwise causes the lender to reject or refuse, approve, or issue a mortgage loan. Okay, so buyer cannot lie. 1. 2, within blank days, 7 if not specified, from the execution of this agreement, buyer will make a completed mortgage application, including payment for and ordering of credit reports without delay for the mortgage terms and to the mortgage lender identified in paragraph 8F, if any, otherwise to a responsible mortgage lender of buyer's choice. Broker for buyer, if any, otherwise broker for seller. So one of the agents involved in the deal is authorized to communicate with the mortgage lender to assist in the mortgage loan process. Broker for buyer, broker for seller, if any, is permitted to contact the mortgage lender at any time to determine the status of the mortgage loan process, loan application process. So number 2 is in a timely manner, apply for a loan. 3, seller will provide access to insurers, representatives, and as may required by mortgage lenders, to surveyors, municipal officials, appraisers, and inspectors. So let's say if the mortgage contingency is waived, right, and the buyer's still getting a mortgage, and the seller is like, well, I'm not letting the appraiser in. You know, I thought it was cash. Now, this clearly states that it doesn't matter if it's waived or elected. If the buyer is getting a loan, the seller is going to let whoever in to inspect the property for its insurability or financing. Okay. 4, if the mortgage lender gives buyer the right to lock in an interest rate at or below the maximum level desired, buyer will do so at least 15 days before settlement. Okay. So number 4, they have to lock in a rate, so long as it's within the interest rate spread that we're going to go over. Okay. The next section is B, the loan to value ratio. Okay. So what's the loan to value? Let's scroll down here to this page here, part of the handout. Loan to value percentage. Okay. Loan, the definition of the loan, the amount bank is allowing you to borrow. Okay. It's not the sales price, it's the amount that you're allowed to borrow based on a percentage of the sales price. Okay. Value, for this purpose and for the percentage purpose, it's the appraised value. Okay, so loan to value. The LTV is the amount bank is allowing you to borrow versus the appraised value. Okay, so let's say you have a $200,000 purchase price. Okay, you're putting 20% down. 20% down is $40,000, right? So that's what the buyer will need, $40,000 to buy this house. The other 80% is the loan, $160,000. Buyer will borrow. Okay, so 80% loan to value is equivalent to saying $160,000 loan amount to a $200,000 purchase price. Okay, that's what we're hoping to get. Okay. Now, let's say for the same home, the $200,000 list price home that we just put under contract, if the home only appraises at $190,000, it's short $10,000. Okay. Now we have $190,000 appraised value. 20% down of $190,000 is $38,000. That's what the buyer needs to put down to buy this house. With that, the 80% of that is 152. That's the loan amount now. 190,000 minus 38,000 is what the buyer is allowed to borrow. Okay. Now, remember that appraisal cut. We bought the house for 200,000. It only appraises at 190. $10,000, that's the difference, is what the buyer will need to bring in addition to that 38,000. The difference between purchase price and appraised value. So if you notice, 38,000 plus 152 plus 10,000, the short, adds up to 200,000. Loan to value is now 152 loan amount to $200,000 purchase price. Well, if you do the math there, that's 76%. So later on, when we go over the mortgage contingency, if you had down 80%, now the buyer has to bring more money. And if they don't have the money to do it, that's their way of saying to the seller, Mr. Seller, I can't buy this house. Okay, with the terms that we had written down. Okay, and we'll go over what happens then. Okay, so that's your LTV. The next box is box C, and if you notice, it's boxed in by itself. Okay, it's a continuation of the outline. You know, it's got its letter there, C, and it says FHA, VA if applicable. Okay, so if it's in a box by itself, it's probably pretty important. Okay, it is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provision of this contract, buyer shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein or to incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposit or otherwise unless buyer has been given, in accordance with HUD, FHA, or VA requirements, a written statement by the Federal Housing Commissioner, Veterans Administration, or direct endorsement lender, setting forth the appraised value of the property of not less than blank purchase price as stated in the agreement. Okay. Buyer will have the privilege and option of proceeding with consummation of the contract without regard to the amount of the appraised valuation. Okay, and I'm going to stop there because the rest is pretty self-explanatory, but what it's stating there is if there is an appraisal cut in an FHA or VA deal, no matter what is agreed upon in this contract, that buyer is does not have to buy that property. They can back out of the deal, they can get their deposit money back, but if they choose to pay the difference, they certainly can. Okay. So again, that's why I have it highlighted, notwithstanding any other provisions of this contract. So everybody these days has their own little appraisal gap, okay, which first off shouldn't be really used because there is an appraisal contingency form that you can use. But let's say you get a contract in from an FHA buyer and they say, oh, we'll pay $15,000 difference of the appraisal value, okay, and everybody goes through the deal and goes through the motions of it, and then you get an appraisal cut, and all of a sudden either they don't have the money or they wise up and realize that, well, wait a minute, I don't have to sign that, I don't have to buy this house. Okay, now this contract is, this portion is written into the contract, and some states don't have it in their contract, so that's why lenders will make you signed what's called an FHA VA amendatory clause, which will state the same thing. Okay, so when your seller gets that clause, they should just sign off on it and realize that they had already agreed to it in our contract. So it shouldn't be anything new to it. I've had some sellers before and talk to them for agents that they wouldn't sign that document. Well, you already signed it, Mr. Seller, in the contract. It's just a duplicate because our contract in PA has it, but this lender is you know, VA is nationwide. Contract in Idaho may not pertain to us. Okay. So just be careful when you accept a contract from FHA VA and they give you a gap coverage and say they'll pay a difference of it. It doesn't mean a thing. This supersedes it. Okay. Any questions so far about that? Okay. D, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development notice to purchase buyer's acknowledgement, get a home inspection. Okay. You should check mark that if you have a FHA VA buyer. Buyer will apply for Section 203K financing, and this contract is contingent upon mortgage approval. Okay, that's where the buyer is getting a loan for the house and the repairs. So they'll get money for repairs. E, certification. We, the undersigned seller and buyer party to this transaction, each certify that the terms of this contract for the purchase are true to the best of our knowledge and belief, and that any other agreement entered into by any of these parties in connection with this transaction is attached to the agreement. Okay. So basically meaning there's no other outside deals. Okay, there's no addendum floating out there that the lender doesn't have that says seller giving fridge to buyer, something like that. Okay. Or for example, seller giving $1,500 to contractor for a repair. They have to see it, okay? All right, finally, now we get to the mortgage contingency now. Remember, before it was at the very top. Now it's in the middle, because everything before this, no matter what, if it's been elected or waived, or F here, it pertains to the deal if they're getting financing. Okay. Mortgage contingency waived. This sale is not contingent on mortgage financing. Although buyer may obtain financing and or the parties may include an appraisal contingency. Buyer and seller understand that the waiver of this contingency does not restrict buyer's right to obtain mortgage financing for the property. So years ago, whenever we see somebody waive the mortgage contingency, it was automatically assumed that they were cash, okay? Which is not true, because right there it says they can get financing if they want, okay? So it does not necessarily mean that it's cash. Now, certainly you can ask for proof of funds and see if they have the cash to close, okay? Or the buyer agent could tell you it's cash, but again, they could change their mind and get financing, okay? Elected. This sale is contingent upon buyer obtaining mortgage financing according to the terms outlined below. Okay, the boxes here we'll go over. Upon receiving documentation demonstrating lender's approval, whether conditional or outright, of buyer's mortgage application according to the following terms, buyer will promptly deliver a copy of the documentation to seller, but in any case no later than blank, and then parentheses, commitment date. So the last version of the contract brought back the commitment date. It actually says commitment date now, okay? And I wrote in there, do not leave blank, because the past, I'd say 5 contracts I've received with this new contract, I think all but one of them actually had a date in there. And then when I asked the agent, hey, where's the commitment date? And they say, well, where? You know, you didn't put in a commitment date. Well, where is it? It's right above the boxes here. So you always want to put it in. Now, what's the strategy for a commitment date? 1, talk to the lender if you're on the buyer side. Find out when they're able to give you a commitment, okay? Let's just go on the assumption it's a 45-day close, okay? They should be able to give you a commitment within 3 to 4 weeks, okay? Now, you're the list agent. What's the game plan there? You want that commitment date moved up as closer to the acceptance date than the settlement date, okay? And we'll go over the reason why here very shortly. But the biggest reason why is the house is off the market. You want to get a commitment letter as soon as possible so that you know these buyers are qualified to buy the house after the lender has already reviewed their income, their tax records, stuff like that. Because if they're not good, the seller can back out of the deal after the commitment date. Okay.
Kong,
Yes.
what if they initially select waived mortgage contingency, right?
Yes.
And then they end up obtaining a mortgage financing.
Yes.
Now, do they have to go back and then how does the commitment date then factor in about putting it on this contract?
Okay, so they waived the mortgage contingency.
Right, but they're still going to obtain mortgage financing.
Sure.
Do they still have to give a commitment date?
No. But you definitely should follow up. Lots of follow-up. Very
Okay.
good question. Brooks, you want to chime in on that too? Because the mortgage commitment date is on here, right? It's on the elected portion. It's not on the waived portion. So if they're going to get a mortgage, then 1, they need to apply within 7 days, right? They have to apply within the date stated above this, that pertains to all the deals, right? So if they didn't apply and didn't pay for the appraisal in a timely manner, then that would bring up some red flags, certainly.
Okay, but they're not required to give a commitment date. It's on
Correct.
you. It's on you, the seller broker, to follow up and get that commitment date.
Sure. Well, get a commitment letter. Yeah.
Letter, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
That's actually a very good question. Nobody's ever brought up. Yep. So maybe that question will answer itself down here then too, Mike. Okay. The loan amount, $. Okay. Fill it in. Don't leave it blank. And the biggest thing too is if you make changes during negotiating, okay, maybe originally you wrote down that the sales price is 200 grand, the loan amount is 160, but you come to an agreement at 210. Well, now 20% down is 162, or I'm sorry, 168 is the loan amount now. Okay, so make sure you change that. Minimum years, typically we see 30 years. Okay. Type of mortgage, conventional, 20% down. FHA, VA, conventional, 15-year ARM, whatever type of mortgage they're getting. For conventional loans, and I highlight conventional because it's only for conventional. If it's FHA, you don't have to fill this part out. If it's VA, you don't have to fill this part out. But for conventional loans, the loan to value, which we went over, ratio is not to exceed, if it's 20% down, then the loan to value is 80%. If you're putting 5% down, then the loan to value is 95%. Okay, whatever the loan to value percentage is. Mortgage lender. Do you have to fill that in? Shelley.
I'm going to say no, because you could change lenders, but I'm not sure.
You can leave it blank because earlier in one of the clauses up here, it does say, actually right here under number 2, buyer will make a complete mortgage application for the mortgage terms and to the mortgage lender identified in paragraph 8F, if any, otherwise to a responsible mortgage lender. Okay. Now, if you are going to change lenders after you put a name there, then you need to do it with a change in terms form.
I have another question. Can I go back a little bit to that part where if they're going to pay cash, but then they do decide that they want to get financing?
Yeah.
And you had brought up that within 7 days, they have to make their mortgage application. What if we're, a little bit longer into the contract and it goes beyond 7, are they still allowed to get a mortgage?
Only if the seller agrees to it.
I'm sorry?
Only if the seller agrees to it.
Okay, so when it says on F, mortgage contingency, waive, the sale is not contingent on mortgage financing, although buyer may obtain financing, doesn't have a date.
It does not. And here's my thinking on that. If let's say on day, it's 30 days till settlement. And on day 15, they decide that they want to all of a sudden get a mortgage after they waive the mortgage contingency. By all means, they can go do whatever they want and the seller will have to let the appraiser in, whatnot, but they better come to the settlement table with the money.
With either the cash or the mortgage, because it's gone past that 7 days, so that 7 days applies to this?
It should, it does.
Okay.
But who's to say they can't do it under the disguise of not, if they want to pay cash, if they can, if they can pay cash, that's fine. But if they say, well, if I can get a mortgage because the rates are low, let's just do it. But on that date, they better come with money to the settlement table.
I only ever had that happen one time, and I just told my buyer, one way or another, you're going to buy the house.
Right.
Whether you bring cash or whether you do the mortgage.
Exactly.
You're buying it. So
exactly.
Okay,
Because yeah, they're already behind the 7 days or whatever amount of days to apply.
okay,
So, I mean, if the seller is willing to do a change in terms, that would be even better. That would definitely protect the buyer. But if I was a seller, I would just say you need to come up with the money. Yeah. Okay. So mortgage lender, interest rate is blank %. However, buyer agrees to accept the interest rate as may be committed by the mortgage lender, not to exceed a maximum interest rate of blank %. So the rates are fluctuating these days. They always are. And you always want to have a good spread in there. Okay. So if they quote you, the mortgage lender on the pre-approval says, yeah, you can get a rate of 5 3/8 today. I would put down 5 3/8 and at least a spread of half a point, all the way up to 5.875 or something. Because today we wrote the contract, it's going to get accepted later today or tomorrow. So that means they're not going to lock in their rate until the next day. And the next day, the rate may have gone up slightly. Okay. Discount points, loan origination, loan placement, and other fees charged by the lender as a percentage of the mortgage loan, excluding any mortgage insurance premiums or VA funding fee, not to exceed blank % 0 if not specified of this mortgage loan. Number 1. The interest rate and fee provisions in paragraph 8F are satisfied if the mortgage lender gives buyer the right to guarantee the interest rate and fee at or below the maximum level stated. Buyer gives seller the right at seller's sole option and as permitted by law and the mortgage lenders to contribute financially without promise of reimbursement to buyer and or the mortgage lender to make the above mortgage term available to buyer. Okay. What that's stating is sellers are allowed to contribute to help get that accomplished, whatever we wrote in that box. For example, our little example here. Okay, remember the appraisal shortage, $10,000, right? Well, if what we wrote in those boxes is up here, okay, the $200,000, 160 loan payment, and we get an appraisal cut, and now all of a sudden the buyer is $10,000 short on buying this property, okay? What that's stating is the seller is allowed to contribute to help the buyer accomplish that, whether it's reducing the price, giving seller help, whatever, as long as it's allowed. Okay. Because remember, if it doesn't appraise, it doesn't just mean that the buyer can just back out of this deal. They have to still make every good faith effort to continue with the deal. And a good faith effort by the buyer in appraisal cut is to ask the seller, hey, can you help me pay for this house? You know, and if the seller says no, then the seller has to terminate the deal then and give the deposit back to the buyer. It's not the buyer's right to just cancel the deal because the house didn't appraise. They have to make an effort, and an effort is asking the seller to help them. Okay, you agree with that, Brooks?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important point, that the buyer can't just terminate or else their deposit's going to be subject.
Right. Because if you notice, we're going to go through this section here, and it does not say anything about the buyer terminating the deal and getting their deposit money back, except maybe one spot. Okay. Number 2, seller. Okay, seller. Seller may terminate this agreement after the commitment date by written notice if buyer doesn't do one of 3 things. Okay. A, seller does not receive a copy of the documentation, the commitment letter by that date. Okay, so if the mortgage commitment date is October 25th and it's October 26th and you don't have this letter, you can back out of the deal. Some savvy sellers and savvy list agents will use that and wait it out if their seller has cold feet. So you want to do that, you know, or they might have a backup offer. Thank you, Seth.
Gong, and can the seller keep the deposit?
No, we'll go over that here very shortly, Mike.
All right.
Okay. So that's one, they don't get a commitment letter by that date. 2, B, the documentation demonstrating lender's conditional or outright approval of buyer's mortgage application does not satisfy the loan terms outlined in paragraph 8F. Okay, so you get this commitment letter and it says, oh, it's a FHA deal now. And you had written down that it's conventional. Or all of a sudden it's a different lender. Or something happened that, you know, it's different from what's written in the box, the seller can terminate. C, the third item. The documentation demonstrating lender's conditional or outright approval of a buyer's mortgage application contains any condition not specified in this agreement. Examples, buyer must sell another property. An appraisal must be received by the lender, or the approval is not valid through the settlement date. That is not satisfied and or removed in writing by the mortgage lender within 7 days after the commitment date or any extension thereof other than those conditions that are customarily satisfied at or near settlement, like obtaining insurance or confirming employment. Okay. So yeah, you have a deal and the buyer doesn't have to sell their home. But then on the commitment letter, it says that they have to sell their home now. Well, that's not what we agreed upon. I mean, how long is that going to take you to sell your house and then put it under contract and then settle? Okay, certainly not within the 2 weeks before settlement. So that is another way for the seller to terminate this agreement. Part 3. Seller's right to terminate continues until buyer delivers documentation demonstrating lender's conditional or outright approval of buyer's mortgage application to seller. Until seller terminates this agreement, okay, until seller terminates this agreement pursuant to this paragraph, buyer must continue to make a good faith effort to obtain mortgage financing. You know, that good faith effort could be various things. You know, going to other lenders, asking other lenders to approve them, going back to the appraiser and saying, hey, Mr. Appraiser, I think you shorted us, you know, that type of deal. So they have to make some kind of good faith effort to continue with the deal. Termination of this agreement by buyer due to the mortgage lender's denial of buyer's mortgage application may demonstrate bad faith by buyer and result in the forfeiture of deposit monies to seller. So again, termination by buyer, okay, to the mortgage lender's denial. The mortgage lender says, hey, Mr. Buyer, I can't give you this loan. I mean, your credit score dropped 100 points, okay? So the buyer goes and says, hey, here's a termination. I can't get this loan now. Well, they could be in default now and lose their deposit money. Okay. Now, Mike, going back to what you were saying about the seller terminating. If this agreement is terminated pursuant to paragraphs 8F2 by the seller, or the mortgage loan is not obtained for settlement. So what does that mean? Well, the buyer gave the seller a denial letter. The seller doesn't terminate this thing. He's like, delusional, thinking that, hey, somehow this buyer is still going to come to the table with money. Okay. Well, at settlement date, if there's no money at the table, the buyer gets their deposit money back. Okay. So that's why a seller should just terminate as soon as they get that denial, because they don't lose the days on market. Okay, you wait till settlement date, and we gave you a denial letter 2 weeks ago. You just lost 2 weeks of marketing. For what? To play hardball? Right? So as soon as you get that, just release the buyer, because that's the mortgage contingency, but it's based on the seller to do it so that the buyer can get their deposit money back. Okay. So again, if this agreement is terminated pursuant to paragraphs 8F2 by the seller, or the mortgage loan is not obtained for settlement, all deposit monies will be returned to buyer according to paragraph 26. And this agreement will be void. Buyer will be responsible for any costs incurred by buyer for any inspections or certifications. So basically any out-of-pocket money is lost for the buyer. Okay, so Mike, that answers your question right there?
Yeah, because I was just thinking of the bad faith effort. If they make a
Sure.
bad faith effort, then the seller could keep the deposit money.
Right. And bad
Got
faith by the buyer would be to terminate. If the buyer doesn't do anything, they don't even have to really make a good faith effort. All they have to do is just not do anything, not sign a termination or send a termination to the seller. Okay, just wait it out. It's up to the seller to terminate. 5, if the mortgage lender or a property and casualty insurer providing insurance required by a mortgage lender requires repairs to the property, buyer will, upon receiving the requirements, deliver a copy of the requirements to seller. Within 5 days of receiving the copy of the requirements, seller will notify buyer whether seller will make the required repair at seller's expense. Okay. So A, if seller makes the required repairs to the satisfaction of the mortgage lender and or insurer, okay, that's actually a very important sentence there. It's to the satisfaction of the mortgage lender and or insurer, okay, not to the buyer. So if they want to post a handrail and the buyer wants a vinyl one and you put in a wood one and it's okay with the lender, that's all you need, right? If seller makes the required repairs to the satisfaction of the mortgage lender and or insurer, buyer accepts the property. Okay, doesn't say makes the repair satisfaction of the buyer. Okay. So that's a very important note there, because people are always like, well, who's going to approve that work? It's the appraiser that has to come back, or the insurance company. Okay. If seller will not make the required repairs, or if seller fails to respond within the stated time, buyer will within 5 days notify seller of buyer's choice to. Okay, so the seller says, I'm not going to make the repair, or the seller just completely ignores you. Okay, then the buyer within 5 days will, 1, make the repairs at their own expense and continue with the deal, or 2, terminate. There's their right to terminate by written notice to seller, and all deposit monies come back to the buyer. Now, right under 2, there's a bold section there. If buyer fails to respond within the time stated above or fails to terminate this agreement, so the buyer doesn't do anything by written notice to seller within that time, then the buyer will accept the property and continue with the deal and make the repairs so we can go to settlement. Okay, so we went over quite a bit there. This is a very complicated thing. It kind of makes you think a lot about the whole process and who can do what and when. But does anybody have any questions about this or any type of scenario you want to ask? I'll take that as a no. All right, well, next week, I'm sorry, not next week, this Thursday, 2 days, we will go over pages 5 and 6. Okay, pages 5 and 6. So, and if anybody has any questions regarding this section, please reach out to us.